being here with me today. I have to admit, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to process and present a little bit about my experience going to Timor-Leste in March of 2023. As you can all relate to, I'm sure, life is always a little bit of a whirlwind, and I hadn't really gotten a chance to go back and look at my photos and really think about the themes that emerged from the trip, even though there's been some interim things that have happened with communicating with folks and things. This was a great opportunity to put it all together in my own thinking, and I hope I can convey some key takeaways with all of you. So I wanted to start out by just sharing a little bit about what position I'm coming from in this talk and the trip to Timor. As mentioned, I hold a law degree and a master's degree from your sister program, the Latin American Studies program. And I'm not actually a faculty member, and I don't really do research. I actually was a practitioner in the field, an attorney and an executive director, but of course had those interests in global work that I had explored in my master's degree program. But then I did have a good ride of just doing work as a Wisconsin professional, as an attorney and an executive director of a regional nonprofit. And then I came to the University of Wisconsin to put some of those skills and expertise that I had gained in the field around tax-exempt organizations and nonprofit organizations to work at the School of Human Ecology. And you see I have the picture there of the actual school, because I like to remind people that's actually where our center is based, right up the hill over here on Linden Drive. And I came to the School of Human Ecology in a different role, a slightly different role, but I then was asked by the dean, Dean Shim, to serve as the executive director of the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies, one of the centers at the School of Human Ecology. We are based there, but we consider ourselves a campus-wide and Wisconsin-wide and worldwide center. So if you're interested in affiliating with us or connecting with us, a lot of people working in other substantive areas do tend to have intersections with NGOs and the nonprofit sector and civil society. So we really have a broad view of who can and should be involved with us. So that's kind of where I'm based, and my role as the executive director is to make sure that the center's work is proceeding according to our plan. And I do have courses that I have designed and deliver that I kind of think of as courses that are very much for those folks, especially graduate students, who are not necessarily going to have a career in the academy. So the courses that I've developed and teach are really, drawing on my experience as a practitioner, preparing graduate students for work in the field. This is a graphic that we put together years ago to show some of the complexities of the way that our center does work, but just to point out a couple of things to you. We are based, as I mentioned, at the School of Human Ecology, but the academic department that we are most closely supportive of and aligned with is the Civil Society and Community Studies department. So I kind of think of us as the hub to the outside world for supporting some of these programs that are listed on the left-hand side: PhD, master's, bachelor's degree, and a capstone certificate. We also are very proud of the fact that we really view knowledge as equally important, to come from the academic side and the community expertise and practitioner wisdom. So we look at, especially in the area that we're in, in a chemistry department, you can maybe go into the lab and really arrive at some airtight conclusions. But in the world of looking at civil society and community studies and nonprofit and NGO work, it seems essential to me anyway that the work that we do as an academic institution be very on the daily informed by what's actually happening out there in the field. So those are some of the principles that our center relies on and tries to bring to these programs into campus, and to take what we can offer from campus out into the field, so that not only are we teaching students and doing research, but that information in a cyclical way is also feeding back out to those doing the work in the field. Wisconsin idea, right? So I won't dwell on our center that much longer, but I think it's kind of relevant for where I'm going with what happened in Timor and the things that I learned and how it relates to our work. So we think of our center, just to simplify what our center does, this slide kind of does that, as having the three-legged stool, teaching, research, and outreach, all connected. This QR code will get you to our website if you want to just have a quick link We also, my colleague Michaela is here, and we have some flyers that you can take if you want the analog version of how to reach us. I include the photo here of the globe because I am particularly interested in ensuring that although we are based here in Madison, Wisconsin, and we do work across Wisconsin quite a bit, that we really prepare our students for a global world. And I think as my points today about the Timor trip will illuminate, I really believe that this idea of exchanging across contexts around themes of civil society are essential for us understanding our interconnectedness, the way that similar issues are showing up across what would otherwise seem like very disparate contexts when it comes to themes like civil society, democracy, sustainability, and the like. And you're all in an area studies department, so I think you get that. So just a little bit of background on how my reciprocal exchange trip happened, and that's really what I'm going to share about today. So unlike other presentations in this setting, which might be a little bit more based on academic research, my goal today is really to tell you about a very just lived experience of going to Timor-Leste and some of the lessons learned and observations made. And again, in the spirit of those principles of our center, I think some of that learning is just as important as that more academic research, although I would love to hear ways that we might connect maybe some of your areas of academic expertise with those things that I experienced on a more lived experience level. So in the fall of 2019, our center, was actually asked by a group of university colleagues, including folks in the Southeast Asian department, to host a fellow, Kwasi, who's pictured here, as an ACYPL fellow. And I'm not sure how familiar all of you are with that program, but it is a State Department program that is very competitive for outstanding professionals from Southeast Asia to come to the United States and do, I think, I can't remember how long it is. It's a 4-week maybe stint that they spend in particular locations in the US. There's also the Yali Mandela Fellows Program, which we've also worked with, which is the equivalent from sub-Saharan Africa. But Kwasi was a professional at an NGO in Timor. He is a trained nurse, and he was working on food security and nutrition for children. And so when people were looking for a placement for him, they thought, well, maybe he could be at a nonprofit. And then they thought, well, maybe the center could be the host since we work with nonprofits. So we had to quickly pull something together. He was a little bit of a straggler in terms of his placement that year, and we hosted him in 2019, and he accompanied us on some of our classroom experiences out in the field. That's us in Milwaukee with a graduate level class at a community organization. We tried to show him some Wisconsin culture. There he is having a Bloody Mary. I think it was a virgin Bloody Mary though. But anyway, just had this time with Kwasi in Wisconsin, tried to do a good job connecting him with nonprofit organizations doing similar work to what he does there. And I think that kind of exchange I've seen be very valuable, not only in global context, but even just community to community in the United States. So he had meetings at feed kitchens in in Madison, other food security related nonprofits in Wisconsin, et cetera. And actually when I hosted him, we were almost automatically put in the hopper to do the reciprocal exchange program because ACYPL had never had any US participants go to Timor-Leste, and they really wanted that to happen. Also in this cohort, there were 2 Timor-Leste representatives, and so they were both placed in Madison, and so ACYPL was really excited about sending 2 of us as reciprocal exchange participants there together and not having to go alone. So in a minute you'll hear more about my counterpart, Kwasi Obeng, who from the city council in Madison, he was the chief of staff at the time. He was paired with Danita Baptista, Kwasi, another Timor-Leste fellow, and then we kind of had this team of 4 that was supposed to go to Timor, but of course then the pandemic happened. So what was supposed to happen in 2020 did not happen. Luckily, I was so excited when I heard that they were going to resume it. They did allow us to do the trip in 2022. So we have created some short form video about this trip, and there's 3 short videos I'm going to show throughout this presentation. And as I'm sure everyone can relate to, I'm making a personal sacrifice of listening to my own voice multiple times. But the reason why I'm including this is also not necessarily as much about the narration, but because they can cover so much ground with the photos in a way that like my presentation really can't. So this is the first one, and I think the longest one. I had the opportunity to go to Timor-Leste as a part of a reciprocal exchange program hosted by ACYPL, the American Council of Young Political Leaders. We had actually hosted an ACYPL fellow in Madison pre-pandemic in 2019 who was from Timor-Leste. His name is Kwasi. And after hosting him, we had the opportunity then to go on the reciprocal exchange trip to visit Timor. I was able to go with another American colleague, Kwasi Obeng, who had also hosted a fellow from Timor-Leste. The goal of this type of an exchange program is to build relationships and collaboration and understanding across contexts from the US to various other places in the world, and in this case, in Southeast Asia, and specifically Timor-Leste. And ACYPL is actually an organization that's been around since 1966. It does a few different types of programming initiatives, including having very impressive fellows from all over Asia and also Africa and perhaps other parts of the world come to the United States as fellows who have to apply through a very competitive process to be selected as ACYPL fellows, and then they are invited to come to a site in the US to spend several weeks and intern or sit as a fellow with some sort of an institution in the US. In our case, our fellow sat with us and worked with us at the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so that's why I was able to then go on the reciprocal exchange, kind of representing the center. Through those types of exchanges, both to the US and Americans going abroad, the idea is that goodwill and learning exchange, understanding, and better relationships will develop not only across the individuals and professionals involved, but I think it's assumed from country to some degree as well. So it's really a program that is meant to build international relations, ultimately. One of the most powerful aspects of this experience for me, and I know for Kwasi, who is my colleague from the US that joined me on this adventure, was the unbelievable hospitality and care and generosity that were extended to us by our actual hosts, Acacio and Denny, but also the team of colleagues and friends that they brought into our experience, notably Mount Mateo and Mount Sancho, along with many other ACYPL fellows and friends. We were treated with celebrity status almost throughout our trip, and also made really great interpersonal connections and had amazing laughs and bonded over just being human beings in addition to our work. So it really made the experience valuable and makes me believe that we will continue these connections going forward. So you see why the pictures are, you can't, a picture's worth 1,000 words, as they say. How do I advance? Yeah. Oh, that's not what I'm gonna do. Shoot. I need to minimize everything.
Yeah. I'm trying to go to the next slide.
Yeah.
So what you can do is just from here, after the video, you have to
Oh, down there. Okay, thank you. Sorry for that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It's not full screen. I think it should work now.
Okay. Great. So we had about 8 days total for this trip, I think. Maybe a little bit more than that when you consider the travel, and the travel was significant. As the ACYPL program said, this is literally the longest trip you can take around the world, from the upper Midwest to Timor-Leste. And you could either do it like one way around the globe or the other, right? That's literally how far it is. You all know this, but it was, luckily, like travel went well, but we didn't have that much time on the ground, but we covered a lot of territory. So Denny and Acacio really took the lead on setting up an agenda for us. We had a lot of socials and networking with our ACYPL folks. But also a lot of times that would include other contacts within the country. And the top left photo here, I really wanted to make sure some representation of this was included, but that's Hotel Dili. Dili is the main city of Timor-Leste. It's the capital, it's where the national government is, and it's by far the most significant hub in terms of an urban center. And that hotel is pretty much where like everything goes down in Timor, as far as I can tell. We would have a meeting in the morning there with a dignitary, and then later in the evening when we were coming back into or we would have a meeting out in the field with somebody, and then when we would come home at night, they would be there meeting with someone again. You know, so I can't quite capture what a hub Hotel Dili was for, you know, at least my introduction to Timor-Leste. We literally saw the president there at a certain juncture. And there are some really interesting stories about the way that that's been the convening place for some of the important negotiations geopolitically and things like that as well. But we also had the opportunity, which was especially good for me coming from an institution of higher education, to present to some classrooms, including graduate level courses at a university in Dili, but also to younger groups of students. You'll see some more about that. And also even to adults, elected officials and representatives. So that was fun because we got to tell a little bit about our work and explore some concepts about the work that we do at the center, in Kwasi's case, the work that he does in government, and then just exchange about the different commonalities that we might have with some of the learners. We also did some specific site visits and learning about the history and institutions. Based on Timor's history, it's actually quite important that I think any visitor go to some of the sites that have historical information about the resistance and the occupation of Timor, because it just sets the stage for the country as it stands today. And again, there will be more about that in the other slides. And we got to have some really special time. Again, it's remarkable to think about the time that people created for us with electeds and dignitaries. We spent significant time with the mayor of Dili, major party leaders from the resistance movement. We had a meeting with the US Embassy, et cetera. And for me, it was important to see what NGO work on the ground looked like there, so I was also able to make some site visits to some of those organizations, some social innovation efforts, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And then we were actually staying really near the presidential palace, and it was the week of independence, so it was great because I got to see a lot about what their pomp and circumstance looked like for their Independence Day. And then just a lot of experiencing the landscape and community. Even in such a short time, it did feel like we got a pretty good snapshot of at least Dili, and then we did do an outing into Ermera, one of the regional areas, provinces that is definitely quite different than the main city of Dili. So the topics that I was really looking at and talking about there were civic health, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with that concept, but our center has an entire initiative that we help support on the civic health of Wisconsin, and we define civic health in that coalition-based effort as how people come together to solve problems in society and in communities. And it covers a lot of sort of traditionally pro-democratic things like voting and media and how you consume information, but it also has to do with a lot of other building blocks to pro-democratic societies, like social connection, civic engagement, isolation, polarization, themes that right now in Wisconsin are way more present than we ever thought we might have been worrying about if we were looking back 25 years ago. But we know that these themes that we have historically sometimes associated with other parts of the world are very much at risk here in the United States. Trusting governmental institutions, feeling like you can talk to people with different ideas. So we're working on that in Wisconsin, and it was, as I'll explain more, it was really interesting to share and exchange about that with folks in a new democracy. I'm also, of course, as my center's theme would imply, very interested in all things third sector or NGO or nonprofit sector, as you might define those terms. And that edges for our definition into notions of social innovation sometimes, so sometimes even businesses that do mission-based work, and this example, among others that I'll share about, are an important topic in this country right now as it sorts out its economic future. Higher ed, of course, I mentioned was also a place that we were able to connect, and I think there's some opportunities there actually. And then it was great to talk about the third sector and civil society in context with Kwasi, who talked about governmental organizations and institutions more specifically, since that's his area. So I think people here are somewhat familiar with where Timor is and maybe even its history. That blacked out slide just shows a zoom in, but of course Australia would be here and Indonesia would be here, and that's where we were. We'll keep moving here. So again, I think a lot of you are probably familiar with the history, but I think this timeline does a decent job of showing what I believe is a very specific and dramatic history that the Timorese people have lived through over generations, and to me gives me great humility and awe about the way that these people have preserved aspects of their traditional indigenous identity and lives, notwithstanding the fact that the colonial influence in this place has been very long-standing, tumultuous, and at times very brutal. So this is a place that had people living in it and speaking multiple languages and having very specific regional identities, even in this relatively small area of the world, and with a relatively small population for a long time. But in the 16th century, the Portuguese started colonial efforts there. And my understanding from reading and being there is that was kind of an odd and passive period of colonial rule. There were sort of these ambassadors for Portugal that were on site, and it technically had authority in various ways, but there wasn't really like an active development in any sort of way of economic foundations or really even like a governmental structure. There was a brief Japanese occupation. There was a vote for independence from Portugal in 1975, and soon after that, the Indonesians invaded, or Indonesia invaded is the way I should really say it, which led to one of the more memorable and brutal periods that many of you may be familiar with, when there were resistance fighters that fled to the hills and the countryside of Timor and remained camped out and remained in resistance to the Indonesian occupation. But of course, the Indonesian occupation was ultimately successful and lasted until, through continued resistance and soft diplomacy by Timorese people going all over the world and telling the story of their quest for independence, ultimately there was an opportunity for actual independence through a series of events and a UN referendum that allowed the Timorese people to vote on either being an autonomous state within Indonesia or gaining full independence. The vote was for full independence, but during those years, there's a very recent history of a very difficult time, violent oppression, really interfering with traditional Timorese ways of life, even in the remote areas of Timor, because of the fact that it was well understood and known that there were resistance fighters that were still in the hills of Timor. And so the dynamic of the occupier kind of needing to be afraid of what was happening among the Timorese people, and then the Timorese resistance keeping a certain vitality through all of that, created some very specific dynamics, and that are still a very big part of the popular understanding of Timor on the ground there as well. So the first elections happened in 2007, and so just thinking about that timeline, that's only been national elections, and just now they're even starting to implement regional elections. So a very new democratic context. And this is included because this idea of truth and reconciliation and sort of restorative justice, or at least understanding the resistance and documenting what actually happened during all of this very complicated and brutal history, is something that has been a very important initiative in Timor, and the museums and the publications that were associated with that were things we got to experience and learn about, and I would recommend to anybody to do that if you go to Timor. So, here we are, and the country has gone through that history. Today, there's 1.3 million people, and there are more than 30 languages spoken. Portuguese has been an important language through time, but Tetun is considered the kind of more common across all of the regions, more indigenous language, but it actually has a lot of Portuguese in it, which was helpful to me as a Latin American studies person, because while I don't really speak Portuguese, I have enough Spanish that I was actually able to discern more Tetun than I was expecting to, which was really helpful. There are actually a good number of English speakers there. There's a big tradition of Timorese people going abroad for their education, and I think that also poses some challenges for Timor because the brain drain thing is real, but we were very fortunate in that being typical Americans and not really speaking very much of the local language, we had a decent amount of folks that could help us in English. So of course the occupation and colonial history has been a huge part of what sort of sets Timor up today, but also that notion of a very strong resistance that really is a part of the Timorese identity comes through even in daily interactions there. And it's important to note that the geopolitical forces were still very obvious and present even in the new democratic posture of Timor. This sign at the top is just, I was taking a run my very first morning there in Dili, and there's this huge soccer and sports field that is right on the coastline there and really green and shiny. And it's basically put in place by the Chinese government. And there's a lot of burgeoning Chinese industry there. There's also some pretty specific laws on the books that a lot of the Timorese friends talked about to maintain that all property ownership must be held by Timorese nationals. But they talked a lot about the fact that a lot of Chinese people are figuring out ways to even use marriage as a way to have a kind of indirect way of acquiring property in Timor. The United States government is also there. The Australian government is pretty visible there, and all of the telecommunications services, which were not very satisfying or effective, are owned by Indonesian companies. So just to give a sense of, this sort of in the middle of the sea country, and all of these countries around sort of have these continuing influences, even if there is an independent Timor-Leste. The economy is driven largely today by petroleum. So if you look at the GDP, it is very heavily weighted towards petroleum access. The petroleum processing is not controlled by Timor, and my understanding is that there was some dirty business done by the Australians bugging phones and things, or bugging meetings at Hotel Dili to basically get the contract to process the petroleum. So this is just an example of the kinds of day-to-day conversations we had with people about the feeling that, even with the petroleum, it's not really felt that the Timorese have full control of that resource. Even if they did, though, that's gonna run out in time. And that's a very important cliff that this nation is facing in terms of what its future economy will be. A lot of the conversations happening there were about, are we gonna look like Singapore? Maybe we should look like Singapore. Singapore kind of being the model of like rapid paced economic development. But I think there's healthy resistance to that concept as well. Another thing I think is worth mentioning, just kind of looking at the agricultural stuff here. I'm sure everybody here has heard of, the coffee industry there. Certainly this is a place that has plenty of, indigenous knowledge about growing food and using the land in certain ways, but the occupation even affected that. Because as I was saying before, there were periods of time where even people going to farm their land was interfered with by the Indonesian government because of this concern about the resistance forces in the hills. So there is a moment in my view that is a little bit about also rematriation, as the way we talk about it even sometimes here in this overly kind of modernized United States, where people are talking about repatriation and returning to some of those indigenous practices to understand how to use the land in a sustainable way. So I was really excited to visit NGOs in Timor because this is sort of my area, and not surprising to me or probably to any of you, there is a very heavy weighting of the nonprofit or NGO world there on a few large NGOs that are funded by or are actually based in like Australia or the United States, right? So this is the Asia Foundation, and that has an executive director who's from California, you know, that is on site there. I think the movement has luckily been towards ensuring that staff and the sort of folks on the front lines of those types of organizations are local, and I actually saw some nice, definitely that is the case. There's not that many people from other parts of the world working in these NGOs, but there are a notable amount in leadership. But actually in complement to that, this picture on top is us visiting a very small grassroots organization run by young Timorese people. Their mission is about health and wellness for Timorese people, and they were very excited because they were in like year 2 of having a grant from Bloomberg about smoking cessation. And so that's just an example of how this is a grassroots group that figured out how to get some, you know, US Foundation money without having to have a bigger NGO over them. But it was funny when I was talking to them about it because they said that when they first looked at Bloomberg to apply for funding, in the drop-down menu of Bloomberg's nations, that what country are you in? Timor-Leste was not on the drop-down menu, and they had to call and say, we are here and we exist and we would like to apply for money. And they corrected their drop-down menu. But it's an interesting example of kind of how these folks are having to navigate perhaps bigger players in the world, and many of us have a lot more to learn about this place. There were some very notable barriers, in my opinion, with internet and infrastructure. I know that sounds like a really basic point, but I thought that I was just having trouble with my access over the course of my first few days there. And I had gone in somewhat naively thinking I'm staying at the nicest hotel in the entire country, Hotel Dili. You know, you look at the website and I should have internet when I'm there. But I actually never really had reliable internet almost the entire time that I was there. And when I spoke with NGO staff members, they kind of confirmed that that's their reality as well. So it was very interesting to think about how they even can get work done in this global world with that being the case. Some of the interesting substantive areas that I got the chance to talk to people about were related to health. There is an actually very daunting statistic in Timor that 47% of children are stunted in their growth because of nutrition deficiencies. There's also, you know, definitely some interesting gender work happening where there are one of the NGO professionals who's actually, very interestingly, she's a Timorese woman, but she came to the United States for her undergraduate degree, and she's sort of leading this work. And she has a really kind of radical way of going about it, but she's trying to build solidarity circles among women and address needs that they might have, yet also kind of honor some of the more traditional structures of Timorese society. And that was something that was really interesting to talk about, allowing women and folks to have their empowerment in certain ways, and then also sometimes recognizing and balancing that some of them are coming from parts of Timor where there are pretty strict gender roles and things are quite different than the way that we would talk about them here. Food security, I kind of mentioned, and then sustainability, you know, just looking at climate change and ways of developing a sustainable economy and agriculture that can actually be part of the future of Timor, when we know that some of the resources that Timor has going for it are actually beautiful, you know, sea access, scuba diving, reefs, and sort of making sure that the temptation is not to, you know, bulldoze over all of that while you're trying to develop an economy. We had, you know, really good conversations about those same themes, not only with NGOs, but also in our educational settings and also with the mayor of Dili, for example, and other public sector representatives. So I think my most exciting topic that I got to really talk to people about, though, was this idea of civic health and democracy. So I mentioned already, this is a place that has a very strong awareness of their historic struggle. So they're not taking for granted what it means to be an independent nation. However, there is a feeling that I don't know if I can fully capture, but there is a sense of we have our independence and we have elections and elections are working, and that's a relatively new thing for us and we're very proud of that and that's great. However, one of the things that I tried to really introduce in my talks was that even with a country that's got 200 years of democratic processes, we see that this is something that you have to stay invested in on a civic health perspective perpetually. There's, we would ask, and there's a newness and a freshness to their independence that I think implicates civic health in an interesting way, which is there's people in rural parts of Timor that have the right to vote, but how are they even getting their information? How do they even know, when the election is coming? And so there's definitely infrastructure around democracy that probably needs to be built out, but there's also right now a really hopeful sense that people do want to vote, they want to take advantage of the opportunity to vote, and they trust that the elections are legitimate. And it was also very interesting to see the way that Facebook there, for example, is used in a way that sort of reminded me of how we used it 15 years ago, where you actually saw your friends' information, and there wasn't this sort of insidious use of Facebook for spreading misinformation or having algorithms that sort of drive people to like-minded echo chambers. And so it was cool to see that, but it also made it feel like there's sort of some warning that we can do about what it looked like for us when things became a little bit different in terms of how we get our information and how that has affected our own civic health and polarization and things like that. The other thing about it that I think is interesting from both our perspective and their perspective that we talked about a lot is the risk of capture. So a lot of the conversations we had driving around and talking to colleagues was about, right now their political parties and their processes are kind of operating at face value, and the notion of lobbying or corporate influence directly on political processes or even through, perfectly legal processes, it hadn't really set in the way that we could talk about from the United States. So we had some really interesting exchanges around kind of the risk of capture. Even though you have elected officials and things look above board and elections are legitimate, even if that's going well and even if there's not overt corruption, there are lots of ways that those processes can be captured by special interests and the like. So a couple of other interesting things I think about these images. This person here in the middle of this post-dinner photo is actually one of the freedom fighters that was in the hills for 27 years. And he and all of his counterparts actually receive a lifelong pension now under the new government. They're recognized as the independence fighters of Timor. Veterans are very regarded in that way. And this person on the left is his 24/7 bodyguard, or one of a couple that came to dinner. And so we got to hear from him what it was really like to be out in the hills during that independence struggle, and now to be in Dili living a life where he's a revered veteran of that movement. The picture in the middle is the presidential palace and all of the military gathering up for those Independence Day celebrations that I talked about. And then the picture on the left is us talking to regional officials in Ermera, which is one of the regions we went to, kind of the coffee growing region. And that is actually where we were talking a lot about the fact that they haven't even gone to regional elections yet. So while they have national elections, those folks that represent regionally are appointments, basically. And so there's this whole next level of democracy or democratic processes that they haven't even started yet. There's a lot of opportunity in the higher ed spaces, in my opinion, in Timor-Leste. We did do an awesome, long evening lecture and workshop in a graduate level community development class at one of the universities in Dili, and those were amazing students that themselves were much like our students in our programs, a lot of them were working by day in NGOs and in these kinds of efforts, and then still taking the master's degree by courses by evening. And then in Ermera, on the left-hand side, there's a small coffee growing institute that's funded by the Filipino government and a couple of other sources. And the point of that institution, that's us meeting with the rector down there in their like cafe on site, is really to have a regional institution for higher ed, because one of the big challenges in Timor is that there's this flight from all of the external regions of this young people to Dili to go to the university, and then they never come back. Okay, so another video. When we presented and spoke in different classrooms and convenings and presentations, it was really interesting to share the way that the US, even as a couple 100-year-old constitutional republic with many democratic systems in place for much of that time, not perfectly and not all quite meeting that definition, but still a well-established government for a long time, that we were facing vulnerabilities in our pro-democratic activities and faith in each other and institutions. And so sharing about those things that we've been experiencing at this stage of our history and talking to them about the way that they're trying to establish government and civil society there in their newly independent state was really, really rich. And I hope that we'll keep the conversations going over time. Another huge theme that was discussed was the issue of youth unemployment and opportunities for youth in education and viable ways of supporting the future generations economically. And because Timor-Leste is a place that is forging a new independent path, it does have a lot of questions, I think, at this stage about what its future economy really is going to be based on. And so that was an interesting thing to engage around, and also to reflect back on when we think about, for example, rural communities in Wisconsin, we're sometimes asking ourselves some of those same questions. So this is a little bit of a repeat at this point. I think you've kind of heard the main points already, and I want to make sure that by 1 o'clock we can let people go off to their next things if they need to, but also open it up for some discussion. So I'll keep moving here. I guess I want to point out just to the sort of seascapes that I've got here. Just, you know, there's visions like this where you see, you know, the sort of industry and maybe some of the petroleum related big boats and things. And then you've also got this spot where, for example, we did some scuba diving, or not scuba diving, but snorkeling. And you did see one of the only other like sort of foreign travel things that you saw there. One of the phenomena there is people coming in for scuba. It's a place that people really regard and want to come to for that. And then I think I kind of included these pictures because I think another thing, it kind of relates to my commentary about how conscious folks are about the struggle that they've been through, is that this youth group was all convened to come meet with us and hear from us, and this is us talking to them with maybe like 100 kids in the room. That was organized by one of these major political parties that are associated with like the freedom movement, and so it's just sort of an interesting and different context than what I was used to, but they still have a lot of presence and pull in that sense, and obviously response from the kids. Okay, last video. So there were some really important things that were learned in this exchange and shared in this exchange, I think. I think when we hosted Ocasio, who was a very experienced and talented professional in Timor-Leste working for NGOs there, was able to come to the US and see the way that we do nonprofit and civil society work here, and get into some of our classrooms and see the way that we're teaching professional skills to graduate students, seeing the way that our community partners out in the field do their work, seeing what the dominant discussion discussions are in the US around the nonprofit sector and the way that it interacts with government. He was able, I think, to also make some connections to substantive areas that he was interested in, including food security and social innovation. He was able to tour spaces like the feed kitchens, the urban ecology centers in Walnut Way in Milwaukee with some of our classes. So some really impressive projects here in Wisconsin that gave, I think, some inspiration about possibilities for his work back home. And then similarly, when I was in Timor-Leste, I gained a lot from observing the types of efforts that individuals and small groups are making on a really grassroots level to nurture better economies and opportunities for youth and for families and address issues of health and hunger and education and environmental stewardship, and also to see a place that is in a very early stage of its new democracy. This is a place in the world where colonialism has had a very significant role for the last 500 years, and the people of Timor-Leste fought and persisted in a way that's almost hard to believe for much of that time until finally in the early 2000s they gained their independence after being occupied and colonized by the Portuguese and Indonesia, and experiencing entire generations of oppression and violence and disruption of the Timorese way of life during that time. So to see a country and people that were getting their new democracy rolling and still having maintained their identity and sense of pride and practice in their lives after having gone through that history was just so impressive, and I think enriched my understanding of civic health, civil society, the challenges and the vulnerabilities that we all face in upholding healthy communities and the way that different influences can disrupt that. So we're almost at 1 o'clock, but just to clarify some of those pictures, and thanks for listening to kind of repeat content in the overview, but the pictures were really what I wanted to make sure that we had the chance to look at there. And some of the things you saw there, when you see the food and the farming, those were all social innovation efforts of individuals who are, there's one business person in particular who had a lot to do with a lot of those images around food and farming, where this is a person who actually worked for the US Embassy for a long time and made the decision to back away from all that to start businesses that would actually just directly employ people. Because he's like, that's what really needs to happen for this to get better here. And so he's doing permaculture and building eco-tourist sites and restaurants and sustainable businesses like that. So there's lots of opportunities for the future. And the other things you saw there, just to clarify, were some of the sites from the museums and archives about the resistance and the history that I've been talking about the whole time. So happy to answer any questions if you saw photos in any of that didn't make any sense. It's interesting to try to put this stuff together, but our undergraduate student did a great job with those. So Obrigado Barak, thank you very much for listening. I think there are a lot of opportunities for future collaboration with some of these amazing people that we got to know and are still in touch with. And I think the bidirectional opportunity to exchange and share about those things that we have in common, notwithstanding the fact that these are very different contexts, is just so valuable, and I'm really hoping I can find ways to bring that kind of learning to our students here at the University of Wisconsin, because I think even doing work in Wisconsin can be made so much better by recognizing some of those solidarity themes and understanding innovations that might be happening in other places. So bidirectional exchange is what I'm hoping we can do with some of these folks going forward. Another quick note I'll just say is that since doing that original hosting of Ocasio, thanks to folks in this department, I now am kind of in the ACYPL pipeline, and so while I haven't had another fellow placed with our center, every time we get a cohort now in Madison, which is basically every year, I will take those students to Brewers games or Devil's Lake or show them stuff in Wisconsin, and you know, I still get a lot out of even just those like very, you know, temporary exchanges each year. And I encourage all of you to, if you're interested in that, let me know and we can also connect you. And maybe you already are, but maybe we can collaborate on showing them Wisconsin. And then I brought the ties over there that I just wanted to point out. Those are just some of the many that I brought back from Timor, because every time that I went to a event, I was given the ceremonial tie. So I'll leave it there, and if people need to move on, please feel free to do so. But otherwise, I'd love to open it up to questions, comments, your insights about Timor that maybe I got wrong or missed. And then I'll just leave this up as well in case you want to connect with our center.